Welcome to Criminal Law Video Presentation 4. This presentation will focus on the Model Penal Code culpability terms. Before we go any further, I recommend that you turn to page 947 in the Dressler book, hit pause, and review section 2.02, parens 2, kinds of culpability defined. This section will deal with purposely, knowingly, recklessly, and negligently. They are the terms we are going to talk about in this video presentation. Take a moment, review them, and then come back for the rest of this video presentation. Moving on, the first term we're going to talk about is purposely. Purposely is defined as the conscious object to engage in conduct or to cause a result. It is very similar to common law intent. It is the goal, the aim, the desire, the reason for the conduct. When it involves an attendant circumstance, an actor acts purposely if he is aware of the existence of such circumstance, that is facts, or he believes or hopes that it exists. Knowingly. Knowingly is divided into three different, very similar definitions, but they depend on the nature of the element involved. Remember, conduct, attendant circumstances, or results. Here we see that for conduct, one has to be aware that their conduct is of that nature. We'll see more in a minute. For attendant circumstances, it's aware to a high probability that the circumstances, facts, exist. This is explained more fully in section 2.02, parens 7. And finally, for results, it is aware that conduct is practically certain to cause such a result. As you can see, each of these definitions is slightly different but very similar. So let's take an example. False imprisonment. A person commits a misdemeanor if he knowingly restrains another unlawfully so as to interfere substantially with his liberty. Remember back to the last video presentation that when the Model Penal Code states a term of culpability in a statute, that term applies throughout unless another purpose plainly appears. Here, this false imprisonment statute has used knowingly at the beginning, and there is nothing that would indicate that another purpose plainly appears. As a result, knowingly applies to all three of these elements. Knowingly restrains another, knowing it is unlawful, knowingly interfering substantially with his liberty. Now, how does this play out when we define knowingly? So let's turn and see. Knowingly aware that that's as to conduct restrains another, knowing aware to a high probability it is unlawful because unlawful is an attendant circumstance, and knowing aware that conduct is practically certain to interfere substantially with his liberty because most likely that is a result element. So this is how it would apply out. So for conduct, we have aware. For attendant circumstances, aware to a high probability. And for result, aware that conduct is practically certain to bring about that result. Going on, recklessly. Recklessly is defined in part as consciously disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk that circumstances exist or that prohibited result will follow. And there's a second part to this. This risk is substantial and unjustifiable if considering the nature and purpose of the actor's conduct and the circumstances known to him. The disregard is a gross deviation of the standard of conduct that a law-abiding person would observe in the actor's situation. So let's see how this works. This is a lot, and it's a lot to bring to bear. So let's break it down into various pieces. So recklessly, there are really two questions to ask for recklessly, and this is how I recommend you go about doing it. The first question, did the defendant think of the risk? It must be a conscious disregard, that is a thought-out disregard. If no thought of the risk, then not recklessly. So this one is a conscious disregard of the risks. Did the defendant think of the risk? If the answer is yes, the defendant did think of the risk, then you must go on and think about the second sentence in that definition. So, that second sentence, was the risk substantial and unjustifiable? This is determined by referencing the second sentence of the definition of recklessly. And there's a number of things to address. We have to consider the nature and purpose of the actor's conduct. What did they do and why did they do it? The circumstances known to him. What did the actor know at the time they took the risk? And then, really, this is the jury question. Was it a gross deviation from the standard of conduct of a law-abiding person in the actor's situation? If it was a gross deviation from the standard of conduct of a law-abiding person in the actor's situation, it will deem to be substantial and unjustifiable. And that will make out the elements of recklessly. Let's talk about negligently now. This is the fourth term of culpability in the Model Penal Code. This begins with the actor should be aware of a substantial and unjustifiable risk that circumstances exist or that prohibited result will follow. Now here, this is different than recklessly. Recklessly was conscious disregard. The actor had to think about it. Here is the actor should have been aware, should be aware of this substantial and unjustifiable risk. The second sentence is fairly similar. This risk is substantial and unjustifiable if considering the nature and purpose of the actor's conduct and the circumstances known to him. The failure to perceive it is a gross deviation from the standard of care of a reasonable person in the actor's situation. Again, this is determined how we determine substantial and unjustifiable risk and whether they should have been aware of it in this instance. So, what are the distinctions between negligently and recklessly? Is the thought process. That is the major distinction, is the thought process. Recklessly is a conscious disregard, an actual thought process of the risk. Negligently is should be aware. That is no thought process, but he should have been aware, and we determine that by looking at that second sentence, a gross deviation from the standard of conduct of a reasonable person. That's how we determine if one should have been aware and whether the risk was substantial and unjustifiable. So let's take a look at some examples that I've created here. We've got our crossing guard here with a stop sign along a highway and a car coming along. And let's see what they're thinking. This person says to himself or to anyone else that's around, "Here comes Jim, my worst enemy. I want to kill him. I'll put down my sign to kill Jim." And let's see what happens. Puts down the sign. Jim continues on and goes off the road where the bridge is out. This is a classic example of acting purposely. It was his conscious object to cause the result, death. That was his goal, his aim, his desire. He says, "Here comes Jim. I want to kill him." That is why he engaged in the conduct that caused this result. Let's take a look again and see what happens now. He's there, the stop sign, car coming along, and he thinks or says to himself, "Here comes Jim. If I put down this sign, he will go over the bridge and die. So he's aware that a result will occur. I'm tired. I'll put down my sign. Too bad Jim is going to die, he thinks to himself. Puts down his sign. We know what's going to happen to Jim as he goes along the road and runs off the road. This is knowingly. This is aware conduct is practically certain to cause such a result. He knows, or he's practically certain, it's not 100% that Jim will die when his car falls off the end of the road, but it is practically certain that it will cause his death when he runs off the end of the road, off the end where the bridge is out. He has to be aware that his conduct is practically certain to cause this result, and this is what we see going on here. Going along, he's now standing there with his sign, and now he thinks, no cars for the last hour. I'm going to get lunch. I'm going for lunch. Hope no cars come. If they do, someone will die, but I want my lunch. I'm hungry. I'm going. Puts down his sign, and we know what's going to happen. Sure enough, a car comes along and runs off the road. So, this may be recklessly, consciously disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk. We see here by what he says that he has thought of this risk. He knows that he is taking this risk. This is a conscious disregard for this risk. And the question then becomes, is it a gross deviation of the standard of conduct that a law-abiding person would observe in the actor's situation? So is this the conduct that we would expect of a law-abiding person? Knowing cars were coming along, knowing the road was dangerous, not taking any other precautions, not getting someone else to stand there with the sign, just putting the sign down, knowing there's a risk, and going off to lunch. That will be the question that has to be asked. So he doesn't put down his sign to go rescue someone, which may change things around. He doesn't put down his sign saying, oh my, there's a man having a heart attack on the side of the road. I know if I put this down, some cars will come, but they haven't come for the last hour. I've got to save this person. This would be different. So what are our questions? Did the defendant think of the risk? Yes, he did. He was aware that there was a risk when he put down his sign that a car would come along, run off the road, and kill the driver. What was the nature and purpose of his putting down his sign? That is, taking the risk. Why did he do it? To go get lunch. So given this nature and purpose, that he just wanted lunch, he was feeling hungry, what were the circumstances known to him? That no cars had come along, but that cars were coming along that day. If he wasn't there, they wouldn't see the sign. They might run off the road and be killed. Finally, given what he knew and why he was doing it, was it a gross deviation from the standard of conduct of a law-abiding person in his situation to put down his sign and take the risk? That's the final question that has to get answered, but you would break it down in this format and discuss each of these. Okay, one last element to look at. I'm hungry. I'm going to lunch, he thinks to himself. And no thoughts but hunger. Doesn't think of anything else. Doesn't totally blank. Doesn't have another thought in his head. Puts down his sign, and again, we know what's happening. Car comes along, runs off the road, person dies. So, is this negligently? Should be aware of a substantial and unjustifiable risk. The failure to perceive it is a gross deviation from the standard of care of a reasonable person in the actor's situation. So again, should he have been aware of this risk, given the nature and purpose of what he's doing and the facts known to him and his situation? Would his failure to perceive it, not even thinking about it, be a gross deviation from the standard of care of a reasonable person? That is the question that the jury will have to answer to determine if, even though he didn't think about this, he had no thought that someone was going to die here, was he negligent when he put down his sign, causing the death of the driver in the car here? That's the questions that will have to be answered. This now concludes video presentation number 4.